I'm just getting something off my chest. Lately, people have been engaged in discussing the bishop that essentially eliminated or limited the quote-unquote mission of divine mercy, the messages, which suggests that the Pope is a usurper. And so I just wanted to go over discernment, because it can be difficult with these things. You don't want to close yourself off, and you don't want to open yourself up to become a doormat for the whole world. So I'm going to get into it. And okay, point one. I'm not going to go through 23 points. I'm just going to go through the points, point by point. Point one, shelving. Shelving is when you hear an idea, and it's just good order and with reason, right? You hear an idea and you entertain it, but you don't necessarily have to espouse it. Now, I'll go over a minor example in my life. I went to university and I studied astronomy in one of my courses, and I did fairly well at it. I knew all of the theories. For example, that the sun was 98% hydrogen and 2% helium, right? And that it was a giant mass of thermonuclear explosions. And that was they quote unquote call it the mainstream theory, okay? And then later on, I got exposed to plasma cosmology in the Thunderbolts project, and they have a different idea on why suns shine as they do. And this is credited to an engineer named Ralph Jurgens, I guess, who expressed the idea that the sun was actually a conduit, an electrical conduit from filamentary electron flows in the heavens, we'll call it. But basically, the sun operates like a light bulb because it's in an electronic flow, which it makes a lot of sense, especially it has a sort of spiritual resonance in that explanation. Now, I don't have to espouse one or the other. I can shelve both of these ideas and consider them until one of them expresses itself as true. And this is the mark of an intelligent person. So, next point. Every message, and we have a lot of them these days, every message you hear, you have to put on your shelf. But you do have to entertain them. If you're an intelligent person, you should entertain any and all messages until the point where you're decided this cannot come from God, or this has to come from God. Now, there are only a very few of them that I've decided it doesn't speak to me. I don't know that it can come from God. And I won't get into specifics because it would be pointless to this discussion. Because this is about reasoning. This is about how to discern whether it comes from God or not. So next point. God operates as a chain of command. Now think of it like blood flow through the body. If I were to take an elastic band and wrap it around your wrist and tie it tightly like a tourniquet, you will eventually lose your hand, because the blood is the regenerative force of the body. And if you cut off the blood from any member of the body, any of your appendages, that appendage will become useless and it will basically fall off. It'll rot away because it's dead flesh, because it has no access to that regenerative portion. Now, this is very central to what I'm expressing here. Now, God operates in the body, through the blood, from the heart. Our church operates in the same way, right? It's through the heart, which is the Vatican, and it expresses itself to every diocese and parish in the world. What separates the universal church, and we call it the universal church, it is the Catholic Church. Catholica means universal. What it calls us a body. We are a body, and we have a natural blood flow that comes from the Vatican. God always operated as a chain of command. He's at the very top, all three persons of him, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. And then the second in the chain of command is Our Lady. She's the queen of all existence. And then it goes down from there to the 9 choirs of angels. At the top, the seraphim. The bottom, the angels. So it's seraphim, cherubim. I believe it's thrones, and then dominions, and then virtues and powers and principalities and archangels and then angels. Okay? And then at the top on earth, we have the Pope as the vicar of Christ. His office is the highest on earth. Any kings do not exceed this office, but I'll get into that. Next point. False prophets are like bards who sing songs that reach the hearts of people, but they sort of infiltrate your reasoning. False prophets work through the opposite direction. They get into your feelings before they get into your reason. Now, God operates from the top. He operates out of mystery, out of beauty. Bards and false prophets, they can use beauty as our human heart discerns it, but not true beauty, which comes from God. The kind of beauty that we cannot possibly explain with words. Now, the ancient serpent of Genesis 3 is an example of the false prophet. What he causes is disorder. He caused Eve to disobey Adam, and because of that, Adam, who let Eve give him a command or give him the fruit to eat, which was forbidden by God, his superior, she corrupted that order, and the ancient serpent had corrupted her. False prophets corrupt that order. And this is why you have to be especially aware of these things. Now think of the Protestants. The Protestants long ago questioned the Pope's authority as vicar of Christ. What generally undermined their movement when it comes to the chain of command is that Luther had rebelled against the universal church, and then his followers, whether 1, 2, or 3 generations removed, had rebelled from him. And then they all started spawning into different denominations. We call them denominations, but really we shouldn't even call them that. They're offshoots of rebellion. This is what undermines the entirety of the Protestant movement. If Luther had been correct, then he would have assumed the mantle of the authority. But Protestants, they don't work signs and miracles, not nearly, not even remotely to the capacity that the universal church continues to do even today. And this is central to discernment. But again, I'll get into that. Okay, so the next point, the centurion. And this one maybe it caught God by surprise, maybe it didn't. But when Jesus offered to heal the centurion's slave, the centurion said to Jesus, no, you don't have to come to my house, because I know how, if you are the person you say you are and you can call to God to miraculously heal, you don't actually physically have to be there. You just have to supplicate to God, and God the Father, He's God the Son. You have to supplicate to your Father, and then it will be done, because I am a man of authority and I understand commands. I understand the chain of command. And Jesus acknowledged that in all of Israel, he had not seen faith like this. Because this is the truth. This is how it works. That God operates as a chain of command, and that he has infinite power. The next point. John 5. Jesus was arguing with the Jews because the Jews had argued against his role as Messiah because he healed on the Sabbath, on Shabbat. And so he had broken Mosaic law. And he had the power to heal the person on Shabbat. Now, I'll get into my next point right away because it blends. John 7. Jesus taught the Pharisees, or the Jews, that they have two separate rights. They have the Abrahamic right, which came before the Mosaic right, the law of Shabbat. And he taught that when circumcision takes place 8 days after the birth of a child, and so statistically 1 out of every 7 children would have to be circumcised on Shabbat, which would have been forbidden in Mosaic law or sabbatical law. I'll just call it Mosaic law from here on. Okay. So he said if it takes place on the Sabbath, it is not forbidden, and nor does it cause anyone to sin, because in right order, the law of Moses is underneath the law of Abraham, the law of the patriarch. So Jesus made the point, well, the Messiah is the Son of God. He stands second in all of existence, above heaven. He stands second to God, which means he's above Abrahamic law and he's above Mosaic law, which means he can heal on the Sabbath, and they can't say, well, you aren't the Messiah. See, their claim is you aren't the Messiah because you broke Mosaic law. His claim is the Messiah can break Mosaic law, so you don't have proof yet. So, the next point. In the chain of command, the prophets are above the kings. Kings like Saul of the Old Testament, Saul, David. They had as their prophets Samuel and Nathan. Now, when Saul made the sacrifice, because he could not wait for Samuel, he needed the power God would give them to defeat the Philistines. But Samuel was operating late, so Saul went ahead and made the sacrifice as though he was the prophet, and this had disobeyed the order of command. What good is a king if he does not obey God? Right? What good is a king if he does not obey God? And so Saul had torn himself away from God because he did not listen to God. He did things in his own way because he thought he had the authority to do so. In the same way, David, when he had sinned with Bathsheba and he had sent Uriah to his death on the vanguard, Nathan said, "You think you can hide from God?" So Nathan assigned him as punishment that he would lose the child that was born to him, the first child that was born, that was conceived out of sin, that he would lose that child. And so he did. The prophets had been above the kings always. We use the example of Jezebel over King Ahab because she was like the curse of Eve. She caused Ahab to cut himself off from God by killing all of his prophets because she wanted Ahab to listen to her, who was a priestess of Baal. This is why she hated Elijah so much, because Elijah actually had the authority that she craved. So she needed to kill him. This is what Mystery Babylon does. She kills her saints. And so, I didn't put it here, but I'll make another point. I realize that in our time, we have vicars of Christ who tell us to obey the UN. And we know that this is contradictory to reason, because the vicar of Christ is above the UN. We should be obeying the vicar of Christ. A pope has to acknowledge his office as a pope. And so if we have a pope that causes an eclipse, that causes that tourniquet that wraps around our wrist and cuts off the blood supply, it will reduce us to a degenerative state. This is what degeneration is. Degeneration is being cut off from God. When you are cut off, you degenerate. When your hand is cut off from your heart, it will degenerate because the blood flow is necessary. Now, we can be attracted if we're feeling like we're looking at the sky and we don't see the sun anymore. We're getting overcast with black smoke. And we can get frustrated. And we can become attracted to messages from false prophets, those bards that play their magic songs that reach into our hearts, because we're attracted to those messages. We're attracted to the idea that the church is infiltrated, and that corruption has risen to the very top. We're attracted to those ideas. And this gives food, this gives an opportunity for the demons to feed us instead of God. How can we discern if we're in a degenerate state and we're cut off from God and we're under that black smoke? How on earth can we discern what comes from beyond the smoke and what comes from the smoke? We don't have the faculties in all of our human intellect. We don't have the faculties to discern one from the other. That is a fact. We're humans. We cannot rise or think above our stations. We're like dogs trying to understand a computer. So the next point. When Jesus healed on the Sabbath, he proved through the power that operated through him, he proved that it came from God. So that's how we know that Jesus, because he's not, as was written in John 9, actually, the blind man who was healed, who was given sight. He was blind from birth and he was given sight. And the Pharisees took it up with him, because if you read John 5 to 12, you'll know about discernment. This isn't new teachings. This just comes from John 5 to 12. It was difficult for the people to discern whether Christ was the Messiah or not. That was the whole point. The problem is he's performing signs. He's resurrecting the dead. He's forgiving sins. They're saying, well, only God can forgive sins. Yeah, that's a hint. It may be that he is God and he's capable of forgiving sins. So he has the power to do it. That's how we know it comes from beyond the smoke and not from the smoke. And so, because Jesus was successful in his miracles, just like Elijah's wager with Baal. Remember the priest of Baal. He made the wager that his straw man, I'll call it, would burn. I think they used dead cows, right? They both offered cows to God, and they made a bet with each other that they'll call upon their God and God will ignite the cow. And so, in this example, the priests of Baal went first, and they kept their cow as dried as possible. They were trying to set it up for success because they were truly materialists and they did not really believe that Baal had this kind of power. So they called on Baal and nothing. The cow was never lit. Elisha left no room for doubt. Instead of setting it up for success, he actually set it up for failure. He doused it with water, knowing that it was impossible for a fire to have lit there normally. And it went up in flames. When he called the God, it went up in flames. That's how we know that he was the true prophet and that the priests of Baal, they were the false prophets. And then they killed the priests of Baal because Elijah acted with the power of God. Next point. The church continuously has mystics, and we have a lot of messages in our time. One of the things that I've found, and this is a personal finding, that I've found is that when a message is given to a child or a group of children, or a mystic, a woman, like Blessed Catherine Ann Emmerich or Mary Julie Johannine or St. Teresa, or not St. Teresa, she was never beatified, sorry. Teresa Neumann. It's Blessed Catherine Ann Emmerich. I don't know about the state of Marie Julie Johannine off the top of my head. And Teresa Neumann, I only found out about her from a talk that John Veneri gave years ago. Okay, so we know that these are great mystics because they suffer the stigmata and because they perform things that are impossible to perform. In Mary Julie Johannine's case and in Teresa Neumann's case, they lived solely on the Eucharist for years. Now, it sounds incredible, but this is how we know that they operate with the power of God. They suffer, and they suffer greatly. During Easter, Mary Julie Johannine went through extreme suffering. And so, this is how we know. Sorry. This is how we know that they're mystics. And the Fatima seers, they went through a lot of persecution. Who else went through persecution? The Garabandal seers. Even though they were having open ecstasies in public, but they were doubted so much that they tried to hypnotize the children to make them believe that what they believed, what they thought was happening to them wasn't real. They were persecuted too. So that tells you, well, it sort of authenticates their message because they suffered to get it across. Just like Bernadette Soubirous. We know that she suffered, and we know that she hid her suffering and gave it to God. And even this is a lesson that was taught to us by Saint Therese of Lisieux. And she also said, every suffering you get, you give to God. Saint Therese of Lisieux, like she said, one time there was a nun that did something, a fellow sister, that did something that annoyed her grievously. And because she never spoke a word against it, she just said, I offer this to you, my Lord. Because, and this is same with Saint Jacinta. She offered her, she did it at every cause she could. She offered suffering for the Lord. This is how we authenticate mystics, whether it comes from the smoke or from beyond the smoke. It comes from children who don't have the imagination or the power to make these things up. They're beyond human faculty, and this is something we really have to identify. That when a message comes from God, it's beyond human concoction. It's beyond our capacity to concoct. It has such a depth of reasoning that we could say, okay, yes. So the next point. We have the holy and the unholy. The holy is the devoted one to God. The great city of Revelation 7:14, 7 and 14 and 21. And then we have the unholy city of Revelation 11 and 17, the mystery Babylon. And we know the difference. We know that mystery Babylon kills the saints, just like Israel did. And Israel eventually killed God. They committed deicide. It turned them from a holy nation to an unholy nation. Now, holy means to be set aside, to be elevated above one's station. So if you're a holy nation, you're better than other nations. But if you're a unholy nation, you are below all other nations. Now, the ancient Jews decided they took on the mark of Cain. They killed Abel. So they took on the mark of Cain. And that was it. They were wandering the wilderness. But Cain had become unholy because he had committed this crime. Cain got jealous of Abel because his offering was unworthy. He did not give of himself. He did not sacrifice. He gave of his abundance. Whereas Abel gave of his own flock. That's what made one person holy and the other person useless, lukewarm. Last point. When a message comes from above, we're to shelve it. But those messages have to be substantiated if they speak of substantial matters, such as whether or not the Pope is the true Pope, the true vicar of Christ. Now, we entertain ideas. I don't forget the prophecy of St. Francis of Assisi. I will not elect, in the last days, I will not elect a pastor, but a destroyer. I keep that on the shelf because it may happen. We have to remember all of these prophecies if we want to have discerning minds. But undermining that current chain of command is a very serious offense that puts us all in danger of not just being not holy, but of being unholy, to set ourselves against the church. So when someone makes claims of usurpation, they better perform miracles and have powerful theological arguments behind their reasoning. Or you can just keep it distantly on the shelf and not even bother touching it. And that's what I have to say.